Imagine, if you will, a world full of orcs, dragons, wizards, elves, dwarves, and hobbits. A world where trees could talk, giant eagles flew through the sky, and where a mere ring was one of the most powerful weapons there ever was. This kind of fantasy land was created by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Though the genre fantasy existed before Tolkien's time, it was through the publication of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series that helped emphasize the genre's popularity and that gave birth to what fantasy literature is today. After suffering trench fever while serving in World War I, JRR Tolkien became the professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. It is here that The Hobbit first took form. While grading papers, Tolkien found that a student had left one page blank in an answer booklet. It is on this page that fantasy ignited as it is now. Written on that page was,
"In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit."
This sentence may sound small, but it inspired Tolkien to find out what a hobbit was and what it was doing living in a hole. Tolkien continued to write this tale. Eventually, in 1936, through help of an employee of a publishing company, the transcript made it through to the chairman of the firm, Stanley Unwin.
Well, my father was the publisher, and he believed that children were the best judges of children's books. He used to pay me, as a supplement to my pocket money, a shilling. So The Hobbit came along, and I wrote my report. It wasn't a great piece of literary criticism, but it was good enough. My report on The Hobbit was dated the 30th of October 1936. Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit who lived in his hobbit hole and never went for adventures. At last Gandalf the wizard and his dwarves persuaded him to go. He had a very exciting time fighting goblins and wargs, and after a terrific battle with the goblins, he returned home rich. This book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations. It is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9. In those happy days, no second opinion was needed. If I said it was good enough to publish, it was published.
After the approval of his son, Unwin published The Hobbit in 1937. The story was a major hit, so much so that it hasn't been taken off the children's recommended reading list ever since. Due to this hit, Tolkien's publisher asked if he would take up the challenge of writing a sequel to The Hobbit.
He sat down and began to write the first page of The Lord of the Rings without any planning at all. There was no scheme, no synopsis. I mean, I've been through all those first drafts, those papers which all still survive. And it's perfectly clear that he was flying blind. He never intended it to be what it was, and it gradually shaped itself as he wrote it.
Starting in 1936, the series took 16 years to write and was finally published under the title Lord of the Rings in 3 parts. The books rapidly took off, and in fact, some say that by 1968, The Lord of the Rings had almost become the Bible of the alternative society. Ever since the publication of the books, Tolkien has had a huge fan group. These groups, however, don't consider their fandoms equal among themselves. There are 2 main terms for Tolkien fans, ringers and Tolkienists. Ringers are the fans of The Lord of the Rings movies and books, but not all of Tolkien's works. Tolkienists are those who study the work of Tolkien. They are also described as hardcore fans that study the works with the same enthusiasm as one would study non-fictional subjects. The popularity of these books was increased when in 2001, the first book was turned into a movie by Peter Jackson. Jackson later released the second and third books into movies in 2002 and 2003. The New York Times said this about the first movie. There are 2 groups probably sharing the same dread about the film adaptation of JRR Tolkien's ornate and busy Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Rings, its most loving adherents, and those who have spent their lives avoiding the books. But neither side is likely to be disappointed by the director Peter Jackson's altogether heroic job tackling perhaps the most intimidating nerd/academic fantasy classic ever. After the movies were made, it is said that the number of fans of the series increased enormously due to the benefits of mass media and advertising, as did the number of people who read or at least heard of the books. The screen-adapted Hobbit is to come out in December of 2012. In today's society, fiction is now defined by the standards Tolkien set. Tolkien's work had a huge impact on the fantasy genre. His works topped all the works of fantasy that had been written before, and it unquestionably created fantasy as what is known today. In fact, Tolkien is known as the father of modern fantasy. Fantasy writing today now uses the themes found in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. If it had not been for Tolkien, we wouldn't have books like Harry Potter, Hunger Games, and many more. JRR Tolkien will always be remembered for what he did as an impact on the fantasy genre and how the genre has developed into what it is today.